Good afternoon from the Nest Centre in London. I'm John Luff, the head of foreign policy. Thank you for joining our regular Thursday briefing. Today is a case of perfect timing for a discussion of negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. As we speak, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators have arrived in Istanbul, the location for the talks that took place between the two sides in April 2022. So in the very early stages of the war, when it had in fact already become clear that Putin's blitzkrieg had failed and that Ukraine was ready and able to resist Russia's aggression. Now that process broke down, not least because Ukraine was not in a position where it was required to sue for peace. The Russian side has argued consistently since then, and I would add without evidence, that those negotiations were going to succeed, but that Ukraine's Western allies persuaded it to abandon them. From the draft texts that have been circulated, it's clear that the two sides were very far apart on some key issues, such as control of territories, and not least the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, which the Russian side was very keen to restrict. It is striking to my mind that Putin has proposed Istanbul as the venue for negotiations. It certainly implies that Russia wishes to breathe new life into the previous format of discussions. So to talk about this and possibly more, we're joined today by Pavel Baev, who is a research professor at the Peace Research Institute Oslo, where he's worked for over 30 years. He was just telling me a few minutes ago that he began his career in a Soviet Ministry of Defense Research Institute, a so-called postbox institute, where presumably he didn't have much access to the outside world. And he, in his words, escaped, I think, nearly 10 years later to go to work in the newly created Institute of Europe. But since that time, he's been based in Norway. So Pavel, thank you very much for joining us. Can I just say to our viewers that there is an opportunity to post comments or any questions, please you use the Q&A function on your screens. But Pavel, why don't we just jump straight in? And after more than 3 years, we finally have Russian and Ukrainian negotiators in the same city, and presumably they're going to be talking at some point later today. Do you think that Russia is committed to a diplomatic track, or is this simply just an accompaniment to military action? What's your view?
I think that for Putin, these negotiations is merely camouflage, is smoke and mirrors. I think he is very firm set on continuing war. Certainly, if it is possible to achieve the same outcome by diplomacy, it will be great. But he understands that the limits of compromises which Ukraine is can accept, even the compromises which President Trump is putting as a part of his peace deal are very far from his ambitions, from his goals in this war. So I do not think that for him diplomacy is a real thing. These negotiations were very clearly for him a way to escape from the tight corner which was set to him by the European states and by President Trump and by Zelensky collectively, threatened new very tough sanctions if the ceasefire will not be established for a considerable period, 30 days, I think was the minimum time. That was not at all his idea. So to escape from that tight corner, he pushed forward this idea, not only as an idea, but as a schedule. We are meeting on Thursday. So, but basically, you are right in your point that it is very much his idea to present this talk as continuation of the talks in spring 22. It is the same delegation sitting in the same Dolmabahce Palace and probably bringing with themselves the same draft papers. While for Ukrainians, obviously, those talks were water under many bridges, and situation is different. And the war has evolved many times since then. So what was kind of relevant in the situation where the Russian tanks were near Kiev is certainly not relevant for them now, where the front is essentially deadlocked.
No, I agree absolutely with that. But I mean, it would seem to me that, and I think you're touching on this, that Putin has been put under some real pressure. And it's a combination of things. And on the battlefield, it doesn't look as though he's going to achieve any rapid results. I was talking to somebody this morning from who's over from Kiev, Ukrainian analyst who's very well informed on these things, and their view is that the Russians might be able to break through the front in one or two places, but they simply don't have the forces available to exploit that sort of opportunity. So, and this war of attrition looks set to continue. Certainly, Putin has enough men to throw into the meat grinder. Military equipment is another matter altogether. But despite what is presented on Russian state media, things are not going swimmingly well on the battlefield, and no quick results can be expected. So he's got that on the one hand. Then he's got Trump trying to charm him, occasionally hinting that he might use some more forceful measures to persuade Putin to negotiate. He's got the Europeans showing perhaps a surprising degree of unity and resolve, although he may not take that completely seriously. So there are a number of factors pushing him in the direction of the negotiating table. So, I mean, it seems to me it may well be the case that he is actually forced to negotiate, even though he doesn't particularly want to.
Well, there are two different stories here. One is kind of a kinetic war, the developments on the battlefield, and another is the politics of war, particularly the kind of big picture of international relations, where we also need probably to put Xi Jinping into the picture. But I think as far as stalemate on the battlefield is concerned, he may still be of an opinion that there is a way to victory, that the long war of attrition is not necessarily stalemate. There are historical examples from, I don't know, First World War to Vietnam War, where a long period of attrition produced decisive outcome. And it's not about achieving a breakthrough in a particular place. It's much more about your enemy collapsing effectively. The attrition reaching a level where all this kind of small cuts, small gains, small hits suddenly acquire new quality, and your enemy cannot continue anymore. Much like in the First World War. So in that, I think his generals are feeding him very deliberately this story that Russian army is pushing forward, that we are controlling the strategic initiative, that Ukrainians having a lot of difficulties with manpower. We also have our issues with equipment and with big battalions, but the opponent is in far worse situation, particularly as the support from United States cannot be guaranteed. Without that support, not only the several crucial elements of Ukrainian military posture will be weakened, but also the moral fiber, so to say, the determination to continue the war would be eroded. So that's the story probably Putin tends to believe, because it generally fits his worldview. About the diplomatic pressure, about what Trump wants from Putin, what signals he receives from the European, from China. Yes, it is also a very fluid situation, much more fluid than what we have on the battlefield, certainly, particularly with Trump adding a new level of uncertainty, of mixed signaling, of confusion, particularly into the transatlantic relations. So I think Putin is inclined to wait out this initial period of Trump administration and to see where the real emphasis of American policy will be placed. And he suspects it will be on China, which will relieve the pressure on him. So in many ways, all the diplomatic dance which is happening, a very complicated one. It's not just kind of two for tango. It's much more complex dance, slightly medieval probably in this respect. The whole point is about whether Trump will get fed up with the deadlock in politics and walk away. And how exactly he will walk away, in what direction, whether he will be, he will just wash his hands over Ukraine and say it's not our war, or whether he will become angry on Russia and go for new sanctions. I think that is really what is at stake in all this complicated political maneuvering, which is happening now in Istanbul as we speak. And I think there are probably even more players in this game than just Europe, Ukraine, Russia, United States, and China. Zelensky had a very long talk today with Erdogan, 3 hours long. And Turkey is another player with a lot at stake in this war. So we need to kind of count many contradictory forces who are maneuvering around this palace in Istanbul, where two rather mid-low level teams are trying to sort out some technicalities.
Yeah, I mean, those are absolutely fair points. I do agree that there are a lot of moving parts at the moment, a lot of different players, and one thing we don't know, for example, is what the Chinese have said to Putin most recently, because it's absolutely clear that China doesn't want to abandon Russia. It probably isn't super enthusiastic about this war, but President Xi has stood by Putin, and without Chinese support, Russia would not be able to fight the war as it is doing today. So there are a lot of things, unfortunately, we don't know. But let's just turn for a moment to Russia's negotiating position. Do you think this has genuinely evolved? I mean, of course, the situation on the ground has changed very much since April 2022. And it seems clear to me that Putin is not going to be in a position to win this war as he would like. I don't think it's winnable at all. Yes, you're right. Of course, Russia is fighting at the strategic level and wishes to demoralize Ukraine and simply force a collapse on the battlefield by persuading enough people in Ukraine that it's not worth fighting. But we still seem to be, I think, a very, very long way away from that happening. So if we look at the issues that clearly were contentious still back in April 2022, so no NATO membership for Ukraine, and that's effectively been at least temporarily resolved because the Trump administration is not going to support it. But from Putin's perspective, he'll want a guarantee that Ukraine is never going to join NATO, because who knows what might happen in the United States in 4 years' time. Then there's the issue of limits on the size of the Ukrainian army. And back in 2022, if I remember correctly, Russia wanted a cap of 85,000 on the Ukrainian armed forces. Today, the Ukrainian army is what, over 1 million, something like that. And the Russian side was also seeking a recognition of Russian as a second state language. And I see that it's going to be impossible to get that into the Ukrainian constitution. So do you think this negotiating position has evolved? I mean, is it possible in the case of the size of the armed forces that Russia will accept that it's going to have to live with something that's bigger, that Ukraine does have a right ultimately to defend itself, and Russia will simply have a forced posture that prevents Ukraine retaking the territories that have been occupied by Russia? And equally, what about the Russian language?
As far as Russian language is concerned, I think that point has nearly disappeared from the Russian position. It may reemerge, so to say, it may come back, but what is discussed in various Russian sources is primarily focused on NATO, on territory, and on Western support for Ukrainian forces. Not that much about numerical cap, but kind of discontinuation of the supply of arms. What again is essential difference between situation now and situation in spring 22 is that in Russian constitution now the 4 Ukrainian regions are a part of the Russian Federation. Annexation happened in legal terms. So in fact, Russia is essentially now fighting the whole war on its own territory, trying to liberate, so to say, the remaining parts of the 4 regions. There is a small bit of Russian occupation of the Kharkiv region, which is not annexed. But that constitutes a significant legal problem, so to say, much the same way as Ukraine cannot accept Russian control over its territory. Russia cannot accept permanent Ukrainian control over bits of these 4 regions. You know, in all intents and purposes, you start negotiate this thing from Russian position, you're committing high treason, negotiating away territory which is formally part of the Russian Federation. So there are differences here, and what is Russia also pushing now stronger than then is the point of effectively about regime change in Kiev, about Zelensky being illegitimate, the parliament being illegitimate, needing new elections in which all political forces need to be to compete under international supervision. All this discourse about Ukraine as a state losing its kind of legitimacy and becoming merely an extension of the European party of war, so to say. Now it's a very, in the last couple of months, very sharp change in the Russian official discourse, which used to be very much focused on United States, global hegemony, Anglo-Saxon conspiracy, whatnot. All this is completely gone. Now the emphasis is very much on the Europeans, blamed to be the party of war, blamed to be Russophobic, and firm set on fighting the war up to the last Ukrainians. All this sort of propaganda cliche are very much used, but the condition Russia is very strongly pushing, even for ceasefire, not to mention the full peace deal, is about discontinuation of the Western arms supplies to Ukraine.
Yeah, agreed. How much, I mean, just thinking about the domestic factors that Putin has to manage here, I mean, extraordinary number of young Russian men have been killed or wounded in this war. I mean, if you compare this to the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, I mean, the numbers are vastly greater. And the resonance of those losses and the number of soldiers wounded, Soviet soldiers wounded in Afghanistan, was actually very great in Soviet society at the time. But for now, this doesn't really seem to have had a sort of great effect, if you like, on the political discourse in Russia because it's so heavily repressed. But at some point, it of course might. And there is a strong constituency out there linked to those people. One might describe them as the turbo patriots, or perhaps use another label to say this is the kind of sort of militarist wing. Are these people going to simply claim that they've been betrayed or Russia's interests have been betrayed if Putin stopped short of what they see as the defeat of Ukraine? I mean, could this potentially be destabilizing domestically? What do you think?
I want to make one small point about your reference to young men being killed. Most of the men who are killed in this war, Russian side, are in fact middle-aged and beyond, even my age, because those who are conscripted, young men, generally they are not very much deployed to the trenches. A lot in the recruitment for the first time probably in the long Russian history is about contracts, volunteers, bonuses, pays. So most of people who are signing these contracts and going into the trenches are mature men who are making their decisions. Money which they are able to earn this way is probably amounts to what they would earn normally in 10 years of hard work. And it helps to lift a lot of Russian low-income families suddenly very much into the middle class. And that's probably part of the attitude in the society. These people are signing the contracts, they're volunteering, it's their decision. Yes, if they're killed in this meat grinder, well, they have chosen their own fate. It's not that they are those who were mobilized back in 22. That's a slightly different story. But again, this is now a very small part of the fighting army. 300,000 were probably mobilized, and some of those were very quickly thrown into kind of the worst possible battles. And so of those 300,000, who is still in the trenches is very hard to say, but probably not much. The casualties are very high, and a lot of people were certainly wounded and are no longer able to continue. So the mood in the society is very difficult to read. Unlike in Ukraine, where you can find all sorts of sources, a variety of opinions. But in Russia, what is possible to see is that there is a gradual shift in public mood towards ending the war as soon as possible, towards finding a solution. And that partly also reflects in the sudden increase in the number of those who are willing to sign the contract, because people expect, I signed the contract, I get the bonus, and the war will end. So I will get all the financial benefits with minimal risks, which is probably not going to happen. These people are going to be disappointed. But as for your question about the turbo patriots, so to say, yes, certainly there is a constituency of stakeholders in this war. And it's not only kind of ideological bloggers who were very noisy and very opinionated in the first 2 years of the war, but gradually were taken on a short leash and disciplined, and those of them who were going too far in their criticism punished. So that generally noise factor is much reduced and more controlled. But there are serious groupings in the elites and in the society who really benefit from the war. Those who are working in the defense industrial complex, those who are kind of this way or that way working in various kind of power structures. So the war generates its own base of support, so to say, in the society. And Putin is worried about this base because it's also his support base. How the decision suddenly to end the war might resonate in this among these not just elites but among wider circles. So he again, with no real access to instruments of measuring public opinion, he needs to assume the worst. So he is worried about this group. He is worried about losing support. And in Ukraine, I heard from one friend the point that Ukrainians are ready to sign the peace deal, and then they will certainly punish the leader who did sign the deal. And in Russia, a lot of people are ready to end the war as soon as possible, but then the question about what the war was about will inevitably come forward, and Putin cannot find any answer on that.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. I was just talking to a couple of colleagues earlier this week about the fact that, after Russia issued its ultimatum in December 2021, the Americans were actually prepared to talk about some of Russia's security concerns in Europe.
Yes. And
it was reported to me from Moscow that some people in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs thought that Putin really was a genius, that he'd managed to engage in this sort of brinkmanship and persuade the Americans that something really bad might happen in Ukraine if they didn't get to the table. They then offered to speak, and the next thing he did was to launch the full-scale invasion. So you could then ask a question about, why didn't he take up that opportunity early in 2022 when it was there ready and waiting for him? Pavel, before we haven't got much time left, but I wanted to ask you really one final question that is indeed about the US. And there's been a certain amount of reporting by Western commentators in the last few days that the messaging coming from Washington appears to be changing a little bit. There's a different tone, and to hear Vice President Vance, for example, say that Russia's demands are excessive, we're not going to allow Ukraine to collapse, you can sense that something has slightly shifted. And Trump has famously said that Putin might be, in Trump's words, tapping him along. In other words, sort of wasting his time and just playing him. Do you think that Putin is concerned about this, or does he simply think that Trump really doesn't have the courage or the interest in using more forceful measures to try to bring about a peace in Ukraine?
I can say yes to both of your questions. Putin is worried about Trump, and he is certain that it's possible to avoid irritating Trump so much that he will resort to some forceful measures. Playing for time is one thing, but indicating to Trump that there are so many other topics we can talk about besides Ukraine, broadening the agenda, getting Trump interested, I think is another tactics. What I would probably point out, again, that Putin indicated as one of those topics, strategic stability. But after the very lengthy statement they signed with Xi Jinping in Moscow, I think this avenue is practically closed. There is really now with this document nothing to talk about with the United States, and I think it was Xi Jinping who really got Putin to sign for that.
Pavel, we have, just before we go, we have one question from Matt London, I believe in the United States. Matt, thank you for popping a question. Matt asks, are the previously leaked Witkoff points, I think Reuters reported a series of points that Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, had, I think, relayed back to Washington from Putin, the requirements for ending the war. Are these to be written off?
I think that the situation is fluid, and what Witkoff delivered from meetings from Putin in Moscow in some ways is no longer relevant. It's a different situation. But the worrisome point there was that Witkoff recommended formal recognition of Russian annexation of Crimea. And I think that under the collective pressure from the Europeans and after kind of desperate pleas from Zelensky, this point is off.
Is off the table. Yeah, I suspect you're right on that, Pavel. We've reached our time limit. I want to thank our viewers for joining us this afternoon, and in particular, I want to thank Pavel Baev for giving me the opportunity to question him and providing us with some really excellent insight on what is behind this whole negotiating process and where it might be heading. We look forward to seeing you at future briefings. We'll be back same time, same place, Thursday next week. That's 3 p.m. British Summer Time. We hope to see you then. In the meantime, please have a look at the little briefing note that went out this morning from Nest Center on precisely this issue. It gives, if you like, a sort of collective view of where the Nest research staff think these negotiations are going. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you.